Hi everyone, this is Shauna Cronin, the Canada lead for the Global Leadership Exchange, and I am here today with Joanne, and we're going to be doing an episode for our mini-series, the Actionable Insights podcast, which is a substream of the Global Leadership Exchange's podcast series that's really focusing on the Canada Leadership Exchange, which is happening throughout the country and then in Ottawa in June 2026. So, Joanne, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself.
Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Joanne Mills. I am the Vice President of Quality Services and Indigenous Relations at Community Living British Columbia here in Canada. I'm a Cree woman, originally from a Treaty 5 community called Ochekwi-Sipi, which is the interlake or the heart of Manitoba. But I have strong ties to British Columbia. Um, Married into the Haida Nation, and my children are registered there. And I'm also a parent of a person who is CLBC eligible and probably my most powerful teacher in the work that I've been doing there. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Joanne. Um, and as a parent, I often say that as well, that our children can be great teachers. So that's a lovely sentiment to get us started. So I'm going to start a little bit by asking you to help contextualize probably some of the language we use in Canada and some of the thinking that we have right now in Canada in terms of systems and transformation and Indigenous partnerships, specifically Inuit, Métis, and First Nation partnerships happening across the country. And so you are hosting a two-eyed seeing match. I'm hoping that for our international listeners and delegates who might be hearing that language for the first time, you can explain what it might mean.
I'll do my best. So, two-eyed seeing was a term originally articulated by a Mi'kmaq elder by the name of Albert Marshall. Um, I think he was trying to teach us to see with one eye the strengths of Indigenous knowledge systems, and the other eye the strengths of Western knowledge systems, and to use both together for the benefit of all. As we have been advancing reconciliation in Canada, we recognize that, our old ways of being and knowing are good. We also recognize that Western ways of being and knowing are good. And so it's really about blending those two systems without diluting either.
Mm.
I think it's also about expanding leadership capacity. It really asks us as leaders, it asks us as institutions to respect Indigenous law, relational accountability, cultural knowledge, while still valuing things like clinical evidence, policy frameworks, measurable outcomes. I think it's not compromise. I think it's a maturity in in the way we plan and think about services. So I hope I've done that justice. Really want to acknowledge Elder Albert Marshall for first coining the phrase.
I really love hearing you speak about not diluting and actually it being an expansion of leadership. And I think oftentimes in our systems, people can feel overwhelmed about trying how they don't dilute, how they can try to transform systems in ways that are collaborative and open, and building on many strengths. And so you're working in disability support systems. And can you talk a little bit about how two-eyed seeing looks in disability support systems? What is a practical application of this way of thinking and being and showing up? How does it look?
Um, so for me as a leader, it really fundamentally shapes how I make decisions, and what those decisions are centered on. So in a purely Western model, we begin with a diagnosis. Maybe we have eligibility criteria or some predefined service pathways. And the system really asks us, like, what category does this person fit into?
Mm.
Um, as an Indigenous woman leader, mostly in government, I think I brought a worldview that begins somewhere a bit differently. I ask, who is this person connected to?
Mm.
What is their role in the community? What will restore balance for this person, between person, family, land, spirit? And then I would start to think about, okay, what services then does
Mm.
this person need? Um, Practically in CLBC, so reconciliation is well underway in Canada. Something we can, happy to talk about in a moment. But there really hasn't been a ton of work done to understand what reconciliation means to
Mm.
people with a diverse ability or with complexity, many of whom are disconnected from their communities, their families, their land, because of a shared parallel history of institutionalization.
Mhm.
And so when I came to CLBC, I was asked to advance reconciliation on behalf of our particular sector. And there really isn't a lot of Western evidence out there about how
Mm.
to do this work. And so, um, I really invested a lot of effort in the first year to find those disability advocates, those Indigenous disability scholars, Indigenous people with lived experience,
Mhm.
Indigenous families, and brought them together to form an Indigenous advisory committee. And then the second year I was here, we opened the legislation and we embedded them as advisors to the board. So as we figure out what reconciliation means and what we should be doing,
Mhm.
um, there are reference group, there are source of truth, there are one eye of seeing in the work that we're trying to advance. And so in year 5, we've come quite far. I would say we have a quite a strong and engaged advisory committee, but also, just in terms of the work we've done in the province, um, we're actually, I think, creating or generating the evidence we need that we can then share with the world. So,
Such a nice future focus and lends itself beautifully into my next question for you, which is how can this framework or these ways of thinking kind of help us, the disability sector, move into the future and help us truly embody truth and reconciliation in the work that we're doing?
hmm, that's a good question. I think so, depending on our positionality, right? I think as leaders, um, we need to not choose one starting point over another. I think we need to be open to that idea. Um,
Hmm.
we need to assess, have the skills to assess clinical need and ask whether somebody, experiences belonging. We still need to track measurable outcomes. We need to pay attention also to relational trust.
Hmm.
I think there's another shift that's critical. We should be, particularly in reconciliation, but I would say for everybody that we support, is my personal opinion, we should center the outcome on the person first, not on the system performance. I think if we start there, that actually informs how we work together and what reconciliation would look like for that community, for that individual in that community, for that community in that nation, for that nation in that province. Um, because it's not been done before. There's no roadmap. There's not, 3,000 research articles that we can draw from. There's not a ton of this work going on in the world. So, I think we need to ground ourselves in the grassroots. So I think, particularly for us in the disability sector, we believe in self-determination. And so building on that, if we truly believe in self-determination, then, the question should never be, did we deliver the service? The question should be, did this increase the person's agency, dignity, connection? And what can that tell us? So what can we do with that that could then advance that work for other people? Um, what else would I say about it? So, so for Indigenous people, reconciliation has been, a long journey. Um, I would say it's been going on for 400 years here in Canada, at least in our lived history. Our colonial policy was to disrupt us, disrupt us from land, from our governance structure, from culture, from family, mostly through institutionalization and residential schools. For people with disabilities who have this parallel history, not the same, but parallel, Western systems, we did the same, segregation, forced institutionalization, separating people from community and decision-making power. So if you accept those two things as truth, then what I said before about starting with what an individual sees as the journey that we need to go on, um, really, I think is the foundation of reconciliation, at least for those of us in the disability sector. If you ask that question to, chiefs who are working on land back or um, communities that are working on treaty, they would have a different answer,
Hmm.
perhaps. But
Hmm.
for us, it's about figuring out how do we honor this individual now that we're here, and what begins the process of repairing that. Um, so it can't be symbolic. I can't do it to people.
Hmm.
Um, I have to share power because I don't know. I'm not the authority. We haven't done this work before. It's not performative. Um, it's often easier to talk about reconciliation, from the perspective of what it's not. Um, it really is reinforcing the principle of nothing about us without us, but that principle is also the process.
Mm.
It requires leaders to be courageous, but also humble, because what we learn in those moments, when we're sitting with people who are affected by the decisions that have been made before or that we're making today, um, is that reconciliation is really about restoring, reparations, repairing,
Hmm.
returning. Um, and for me, who works in government, to do that, I have to sit in circle with the people that have been disrupted, and really take into account not just their hopes and dreams, but what they've identified as important to them. Um, I think the last thing I would say about it, and probably the most challenging part as a leader in the system, is then translating that for the system into things that a bureaucracy or a system can actually
Mm.
uptake. So, you know, I was given a goal, help people from woodlands reconnect to their community. So there are people who were in institutions who have been, um, disconnected for a very long time.
Hmm.
And when institutions closed, um, not many of them got to go back to their community if they were Indigenous.
Hmm.
And so 25 years later, I've been tasked with trying to help people to reconnect to their community. But community is also disconnected from them.
Mm.
Disability confidence is low. Um, so I created a funding transfer agreement. So I was told, what I heard as I listened in the circle is,
Hmm.
help me go home. And I'm like, how do I do that? So I
Yeah.
created a funding transfer process so that communities could begin to deliver their services to their own folks as a first step to helping people go home. So that's kind of how I would see it applying in our system.
So when you provide these examples of how this can look in community, there's an aspect that's coming through for me around creativity. And in leadership, having to work within the structures that exist, or having to work within the policies, or having to work within the programs as articulated or as funded is a reality that many leaders have to contend with. Can you speak a little bit to how do you, as a leader, find creative solutions within those structures that might exist and make that look the way it needs to for people?
So first, I think I embrace a certain truth. One is that um, there are many ways to accomplish something. There's no one source of truth. There's no one way of doing things. There's not a right way. There might be a right way for some people, but there's not a right way for all people. Um, so I would say I always, first of all, question um, the way that we've, interpreted uh, how things should be done. Um, because just because they've been done that way doesn't mean they're actually even good for anybody. It's just the way we've done it. So second thing I do is I really focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve. Um, is the problem I need to help people reconnect that have been disconnected for 25 years? Is that the problem I'm trying to solve? How do I do that then? Right? And start from there. So I think those two things are always, kind of how I ground myself before I start that work. Um, and then, I mean, the joke that I make is, there's always a way. It might take a little effort. So if I go back to my funding transfer agreement example, hadn't been done before. However, we had lessons in procurement law, right? So we know how to do that really well. We understand free trade agreements. We know how to do that really well. We understand standards. We know how to, and policies. We do that very well. So what can I learn from those things to create something that would look a bit different, still compliant, but enable that pathway home? Um, all of the same kinds of things we would do, had to have a legal consult, had to do a jurisdictional scan, had
Hmm.
to look at what are other people doing in this way. I actually learned a lot from some of the work that the province is leading around uh, shared decision-making agreements. So taking a number of different things that we know and are sources of our Western evidence, and then adapting them
Yeah.
and trying it. And then you evaluate. So you always start small.
Hmm.
Um, and then you evaluate and decide whether that's the right way to scale or move forward. In the work that we did to create the funding transfer agreements, our partner in that was the Secwepemc Child and Family Services, which is an Indigenous child and family services agency to 7 Secwepemc communities here in the province. And they volunteered to be our partner to try and figure this out together. And so we're now in year 3, and we're about to kind of pause and take a breath and evaluate
Hmm.
um, from both perspectives, right? Because it's been hard on them. It it was deep learning for us, um, and really with the lens of how do we do this easier now? How do we how do we make this more efficient? before we scale. So, I think risk is, for me, the risk wasn't material. Um,
Mm.
it was effort and
Yeah.
hours.
Yeah.
And you're right, creativity, but really a courageous willingness
Hmm.
grounded in this humility
Yeah.
to try and figure it out. And then
To try
also
something.
to try something. And then
Yeah.
also if it doesn't go well, to say, oh well, that didn't work. Let's try something different.
Yeah.
Um, so, and one of the things about reconciliation, which I think is also true about inclusion, disability inclusion, is that there's not a one size fits all approach.
Hmm. Hmm.
You ask one person what inclusion means in their life versus another person, and they'll have different answers. Well, that's also true for reconciliation. There are 203 First Nations in British Columbia. They're sovereign. And so we
And
may
not homogenous.
not homogenous at all. Um, and so what I'm trying to scale is not uh, the services we do or how we do the services. I'm trying to scale the process to get us there.
Yeah.
That can be applied then, uh, with the necessary flexibility um, to really honor and respect those nations' culture and desires. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
um,
Leveraging what's there, but also it sounds like there's a cautious bravery a little bit where you're learning and understanding before scaling.
yeah.
To your earlier point, because just because we can do something doesn't mean we always should.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, it's sort of a lovely segue into thinking about the leadership exchange that you and I are working on together with many other partners across the country.
Yeah.
And really it's about leadership. Um, and I think it's a very important time nationally, but also globally to be having conversations about what leadership is, how it looks. And it's often about managing uncertainty right now. The leaders I speak to across the country, a lot of them are contending with socioeconomic uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, and then also just the very human uncertainty as a leader of what should I do in this very specific situation? How do I show up best as a person, as a leader? So can you speak a little bit about how leaders can build interconnectedness and bridge the silos that exist at community, national, and international levels?
That's a great question. I think, I think the Global Leaders Exchange is a great opportunity for that. Having been to two of the conferences now and really being able to connect with scholars and people with experience and same idea as two I'd seen, just really leaning in to learn from everybody and embrace all these different ways of being and knowing in a very relational way. I think that, is probably the simplest way. Um, in terms of how do we lean into each other, you're right. We're in a very interesting time. Um, Not only, is the world becoming more and more complex, people are becoming more and more complex. And, I think our simple solutions or the way that we used to look at leading an organizations no longer works. Um, I think that we need to be intentional in a more consistent fashion uh, to sitting together, as I would say in my Cree way, to sitting together in circle, to putting our heads together. Um, I think that some of the best solutions, even looking back over history, at times when communities were struggling, as we are now, when you lean into each other and around a shared set of values and a shared vision of what you want your future to look like, and you're intentional with that, and you put energy into that, um, what history tells us is those are the things that tend to come through the difficult times. And so if we see ourselves not as disconnected countries, but as uh, leaders with a common goal or a common vision, um, if we are willing to share with each other, give time to each other, and be open, I think we can begin, if not to advance, at least hold um, what we have created so far, how far we have come. For us, for me as a person who is, very passionate about uh, disability justice, um, I felt a bit concerned with some of the language I've heard in the world today. I'm a strong believer in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I feel like it's one of my grounding frameworks. Um, and so I'm, really very interested in connecting deeply with other leaders who share my passion for that work, but also who have um, experiences that I can learn from. And um, also, just to hold each other up. I think that's important, especially when things get challenging. Um, I hope that answers that question.
I think it answers it beautifully and um, segues very nicely into sort of the next piece. And disability justice um, and human rights, I think, are important and powerful ways of having conversations that ground us in accountability of as leaders what our responsibility is. And I think is important. They're important concepts for us to really critically reflect on, I think individually but collectively, in understanding our power and our privilege as leaders.
Mm,
And the space that we hold, the conversations that we can facilitate, the bravery and humility that you spoke to so beautifully earlier that we can either exhibit or not. And so as we're welcoming international delegates together in Canada, and I love what you're saying, it's not necessarily separate countries or even separate individuals. Is there a commonality? Is there a common vision and something that unites us as we hold these leadership roles coming together? But as we welcome them to Canada in June, um, how can we expand and share Canada's learnings around truth and reconciliation to global conversations on some of those critical pieces like human rights and disability justice that I think we all need to be accountable to as leaders.
mm. That, so the matches are a great opportunity. I'll make a plug for mine.
Love that.
We're hosting a match here. Our Indigenous Advisory Committee is hosting a match here in June called Leading in Between Two Worlds. And we're welcoming people who are, interested in designing systems that are meant to um, meet the diverse people's needs that come towards us. Um, so I'm really excited about that. Uh, so I would say participate in a match, um, and, bring your wisdom. And um, for those of us that are hosting a match, I feel very honored to be able to do that, to share what we're learning here. So that's one way. I would say another way is, um, beyond the Global Leaders Exchange, we need to do our best to remain connected. We will find, you will find at the GLE conference people who are like-minded to you. I definitely did when I went to Utrecht, and I definitely did when I went to Chicago. And I remain connected to those folks and have continued to grow, not just my knowledge, but my confidence, my voice, the conviction in my voice, which I think is very important. I am privileged as a leader. I hold a, I hold a space that, not many people get to hold.
Mhm.
And, I'm deeply, deeply conscious that, people like my daughter's voice is not that powerful yet in the world. And so, I do my best to elevate that. Um,
Mhm.
and if you think about coming back to my circle analogy, if you think about a circle of leaders that have that conviction and a shared message, I think that's quite powerful.
Mhm.
Um, we do have the ability to influence and shape um, decisions that are made, um, in it for institutions and in systems, in communities, um, sometimes just communities. And, the stronger that voice, collective voice gets, I think the bigger our influence becomes.
Mhm.
And, I'm interested in that. I'm definitely interested in promoting, at least sustaining how far we've come with respect to the rights of adults with disabilities, our understanding of persons with lived experience.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so we can change how decisions are made together. One voice, probably not. Um, all voices together. I think that's powerful. As a person, as an Indigenous person in Canada, and certainly, have lived that. I grew up, there was a time in my life when, I had to have permission to leave my community. And
Mhm.
now I enjoy, all the same rights and freedoms as everybody else. But that was a collective effort, and it was our collective voices and a persistence, a respectful persistence. And yeah, one of the other things that I would say around this is I've seen a change in our young leaders,
Mhm.
and I'm very interested in learning from the younger generation of leaders that are coming up. Um, that the idea of dignity, belonging, equity, it's not something they seem to have to learn. It kind of seems to be who they are today, probably as a result of growing up in a very global geopolitical world.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so, welcoming those young leaders to our conversation, and hopefully those young leaders welcoming us older leaders to their conversations.
Mhm.
I mean, this really gives me hope that, you know, the shift is already underway. Um, yeah, that's what I would say.
Being a parent to many teenagers, I would concur with you. I think that there is a movement for the future that makes me very excited. And I love the idea of us coming together in circle and community, in a shared vision of what we hope to achieve. And it makes me think that there is a a strong responsibility that we all have to ensure we're not appropriating voice, but that we are amplifying voice. Um, for those who, to your point, have not been invited in
Mm.
to circle or community or decision making or leadership yet.
Yeah.
And your sentiments about young leaders and kind of the future and having hope for the future, I think is a lovely way to sort of invite people that might be joining us internationally or from across the country to join us
Hmm.
and be part of that momentum of leaders. And Joanne, it's been such a privilege to hear your reflections as a leader and just your how gracious you've been in sharing. So thank you for that. And I'm going to turn it to you and see if there's anything else you would like to add.
Just, I think the last thing I would say, and I think it's probably the thing I hear the most from my advisory committee, we are so, you know, we're in such unique positions as leaders to really influence, what happens next. Um, and so I'm going to paraphrase one of the beautiful women on my advisory committee. But she always reminds me that when she was in Woodlands, that decisions were made for her, things were defined for her. She had no autonomy, and as professionals, we were positioned as having all of the authority, and so it's almost like she sits on my left shoulder, I guess, right? Um, So I think the last thing I would leave with us as leaders is we need to always have the people that we are um, supporting or who are benefiting or accessing services that we're designing or at the table with us, telling us how to build them. Like I think if we did nothing else, if we did that, um, we have the beginning of two-eyed seeing, we have the beginning of reconciliation, and we have the beginning of disability justice. And so my little wave to Charlene. I hear you, Charlene. Nothing about us without us. You taught me well, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you, Joanne. It's been a lovely conversation today, and I'm excited for it to continue in June.
Yes, very excited. Thank you so much for having me, Shauna, and for this opportunity.